Mark, thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. And I really just want to thank everybody from the Society of the Cincinnati and the American Revolution Institute. You've all been so wonderful, so gracious, so helpful. Thank you. So thank you to Andy Morse, Andrew Outen, Thomas Lannon, Glenn Hennessy, and probably many other people whose names I have omitted, for which I apologize. But everyone has just been wonderful. And as I don't think you actually did mention this, Mark, so 10 years ago, my book on Lafayette came out, and that same year I had the great good fortune to give a book talk and stay overnight at Anderson House. And that was quite an honor. But it's even more of an honor for me to speak tonight on Lafayette at the annual membership meeting of the society that he loved so much. And it's still more exciting that many of the objects that I'm going to speak about this evening are right across the street. You can go see them. If you haven't seen them yet, I highly recommend them. It's a small exhibition at Anderson House, but a wonderful one, really very much worth your time. So please go see it. All right, as you've already heard, this is the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's Triumphal tour of the United States. And I'd like to start with a summary of how that remarkable tour came about, how it captured the imagination of the American populace, and then I'd like to turn to the ways that it celebrated not only Lafayette and not only the Revolution, but also the Revolution after the Revolution. And by that I mean the blossoming of American manufacture and trade that Lafayette and many other members of the Society of the Cincinnati had fostered in the years since the conclusion of hostilities. So first, I'd like to situate the tour in the context of Lafayette's life in the 1820s. Following a tumultuous career in the French Revolution, a career that saw him being despised by not only the monarchists, but also the Jacobins, and that ended with his imprisonment and exile for most of the 1780s, Lafayette laid low throughout the Napoleonic era and returned to public life in 1818. That year, he began serving in France's Chamber of Deputies, and for 5 years, he advocated loudly and consistently for liberal causes both abroad and at home in France. He was joined in the chamber by his son, speaking of names, George Washington Lafayette, and together, they agitated to establish free public education in France. They lobbied to lower the restrictions on voting. And he spoke on international matters, voicing strong support for liberty in every form, from insurgencies and revolutions in Greece to Italy to Poland, and inveighing against the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. But in late 1823, he faced the prospect of losing his seat in the next election. So he wrote to President Monroe, who is a comrade in arms from the American Revolution, and he expressed his desire to come back to the US once more. You see, in the United States, unlike France, Lafayette's reputation still glowed bright. So in his reply, Monroe informed Lafayette that, quote, Congress has passed a resolution to express to you the sincere attachment of the entire nation and its ardent desire to receive you again. And so on August 16, 1824, Lafayette, George, and their entourage began the 13-month journey you've already heard about and outlined on this map. And what you can see here, well, you could, if you could make out the colors, which you kind of can't, but basically the routes that are in red were overland routes, and the routes that are in blue were water routes. And he traveled by every conceivable means, by horse, by carriage, by barge, by steamboat, by foot. He traveled the entire width and length of this country. And everywhere he went, Lafayette was celebrated in a way that the young nation had never been celebrated before. Really, no matter where you were in this country, you could attend a ball honoring the nation's guest, like the one held at Castle Garden in New York, which you see the invitation for here. Or You could listen to a march like this one, written for his arrival in Baltimore. And at these events, you could wear leather gloves printed with images of Lafayette's face, or a silk sash featuring the words, "Welcome Lafayette." You can see this one across the street. Or you could purchase in Philadelphia a cotton kerchief that summarized his biography. You could attend a parade where a horse-drawn float carried a printing press that was churning out odes to Lafayette as it made its way through the streets of Philadelphia. You could purchase pottery inscribed with his signature. You could buy a cake embellished with a cake print that impressed into its top the outline of the joint French-American victory at Yorktown. You could drink from a flask bearing Lafayette's profile, or you could play cards with a deck in which the ace of spades included Lafayette's image underneath the words, "American manufacture." And it's this last piece that I'd like to focus on today. You see, the celebration of American manufacture led to the fact that each and every one of the objects that you're seeing here was made in the United States. Now, again, I'd like to suggest that industry had blossomed to this degree in the nation's first 50 years in part because of Lafayette and the Society of the Cincinnati, and that this was as much a cause for celebration as the return of the general himself. And I'd also like to suggest that Lafayette's role in the revolution after the revolution provides a good answer to the question posed in this letter, which is also included in the Anderson House exhibition. Here, Elizabeth Crosby describes Lafayette's August 1824 visit to her hometown in Massachusetts, and she wrote, quote, "You have doubtless seen much in the papers about the gratitude due to this distinguished stranger. All voices cry out that gratitude should be proportionate to his disinterestedness. But this is all fudge, and in my opinion, quite ridiculous." This is still her, by the way, not me, just to clarify. "The general," she wrote, "like other young men, was ambitious, desirous of fame, fond of distinction, and inspired with a love of military glory. America opened before him a field of the exertion of all his powers in the pursuit of the object of all his wishes. He left France and visited the then rebel America from the same motives that every young officer enters the army. Why run mad for this, she asks. There's as much due to Lafayette as to any other general of equal merit, and no more." Now, to an extent, Elizabeth had a point. Raised with tales, sometimes embellished, of the military exploits of his ancestors, and educated in a classical tradition that prized disinterested glory, Lafayette was much like other noblemen of the age. And had his role in the birth of the U.S. been restricted to his prowess on the battlefield, then Elizabeth might have been right. But I believe that Lafayette did at least as much service to the nation in his role beyond the military. Now, I'd also like us to remember that on or off the battlefield, the American fight for liberty was not only about political freedom. It was also about economic freedom. And here we're looking at the Declaration of Independence, which is probably best remembered for its assertion of first principles. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But after this aspirational statement of universal rights comes on some very specific enumerations of a host of complaints against King George III. And among them are two that are specifically economic. The signers objected to the monarchy, in part, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, and it asserted that as free and independent states, the United States have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And in fact, the goals of depriving Britain of its valuable colonies and forging trade relations with the newly liberated United States were among the reasons that the French monarchy supported the American rebels. Writing in his 1779 memoir, Lafayette suggested that he understood as much when he signed on with the American representative Silas Deane to serve as a major general in the Continental Army. And by the way, this is the image also across the street. See, I'm pitching your exhibition. It's a good one. I am an art historian, so I have to admit that I do incline towards the visual here. When Lafayette signed on with Silas Deane to serve as a major general, he wrote about it in 1779, and he wrote that, quote, "The destinies of France and her rival, meaning England, were both to be decided in this war. England was to lose a great amount of commerce, of which she derived sole advantage." Now, in no way do I mean to minimize Lafayette's contributions on the field of battle. He was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777, and he was aided off the field by someone who might or might not have been a man named Andrew Wallace. And Andrew Wallace's portrait is on view in the exhibition, and it's worth looking at the portrait and worth reading the story, and even better, talking to Andrew Outen about it, because it's a great story. When he returned briefly to France in 1778, Congress underscored Lafayette's military achievements by ordering that he be presented with, quote, "an elegant sword and proper devices." And Lafayette's role in the victory at Yorktown that marked the end of major hostilities is among the most often pictured moments and objects and images celebrating Lafayette, as seen in these two objects from the current exhibition. Now, in fact, Lafayette's role in the birth of the United States tends to be so fully associated with the revolution itself that in Lin-Manuel Miranda's magnificent musical Hamilton, a single actor plays Lafayette in the first act, which ends in 1781 with Yorktown, and then the same person emerges as Thomas Jefferson in the second act, because presumably we're done with Lafayette. In reality, though, Lafayette's work on behalf of the United States had only just begun. So before Lafayette sailed for France in November 1781, that is, after Yorktown, he returned to France. And before he left, Congress established an advisory role for him in building relations between France and the United States. They passed a resolution requiring the American Superintendent of Finance, Secretary for Foreign Affairs, and the Board of War to keep Lafayette apprised of developments touching the affairs of their respective departments. And at the same time, they directed Benjamin Franklin, who was serving as Minister Plenipotentiary to the Court of Versailles, to employ the assistance of Lafayette in accelerating the supplies which may be afforded by His Most Christian Majesty for use in the United States. Now, Lafayette was inspired by this vote of confidence from Congress, and he set about devising his own assignments and continuing to do whatever he could to build French-American relations. And first among these was to facilitate the establishment of the Society of the Cincinnati in France. Now, of course, this audience is more familiar than I am with the history of your venerable organization, so I do hope that you'll forgive my temerity in highlighting one piece of the Society's institution as it relates to today's topic. And that's actually the very first sentence, which reads that, quote, "the free, independent, and sovereign United States are now, quote, connected by alliances founded on reciprocal advantage with some of the great princes and powers of the earth." And of course, France was the great power with which the United States had forged the most significant alliance. Now, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, who had served as a military engineer and was an original member of the Society, famously designed the eagle of the Cincinnati. But it was at Lafayette's home that the French officers gathered to receive their insignia. And it was Lafayette who became the Society's primary spokesperson in France. Throughout 1782 and 83, advancing the goal of establishing favorable trade relations between the US and France was Lafayette's primary focus. As he explained in a December 1783 letter to George Washington, he had been, quote, collecting the opinions of every American merchant within my reach. And this consultation had resulted in a 12-page document designed to persuade France to grant commercial concessions to the United States. And here I'm showing you a portrait of French finance minister Charles-Alexandre de Calonne, who, along with France's foreign minister Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes, was among the French recipients of Lafayette's observations on commerce between France and the United States. So writing to these French ministers, Lafayette suggested how France might go about creating, quote, a taste for our manufactures in the US. And I thought it was interesting that one of the things that he suggested was that they might want to tone things down a little bit if they were going to be selling them here, because Americans wanted things a little plainer than they tended to like them in France. But he also argued that France would benefit from increasing American imports into France. Now, this was a tough sell in a mercantilist economy where protectionist practices imposed hefty taxes on foreign-made goods. But throughout the 1780s, Lafayette and his American colleagues did persuade France to establish 4 free ports where items arriving on American ships would be exempt from all duties. And it's also important, I think, and this relates again back to the US tour, that Lafayette also had an American audience in mind when he wrote this, because he also sent copies of his observations on commerce to Robert Livingston, saying, quote, I have a great value for my American popularity, and I want the people at large to know my affection for them and my zeal for their service. To help spread the word, he asked Livingston if he could ask Congress to publish a resolution announcing its approval. And likewise, he sent a copy to his former aide-de-camp, James McHenry. And he asked McHenry if he would only, quote, be so kind as to take care that my commercial efforts be known in America. Now, of course, Lafayette was far from the only member of the Society of the Cincinnati working to advance the joint causes of industry and trade that constituted the revolution after the revolution. The leadership on that front came directly from the top, George Washington. He famously wore an American-made broadcloth suit at his inauguration. And when he presented his agenda to the joint session of Congress in January of 1790, he discussed the fact that a nation, in order to assure its ongoing liberty, would have to have a degree of independence in terms of its own production, its own manufacture. With this idea in mind, Congress commissioned from Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, yes, another of your members, the report that became known as the Report on the Subject of Manufactures, delivered in 1791. Now, this built upon writings that Hamilton had already started in the 1787 and 1788 Federalist Papers. And there he laid out a detailed vision of an American economy that would encourage both domestic manufacture and, to a degree, foreign trade. Now, Hamilton's plans were quite maybe abstract, theoretical, very, very well argued, but they garnered support in very concrete ways from other members of the Society of the Cincinnati. So I've written elsewhere about a man named Richard Platt. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Richard Platt, but he was an original member of the Society. And he seems to have been the mastermind behind a parade that was actually very, very important in the history of New York. It was the 1788 federal procession through Lower Manhattan. And what you're seeing here is the route of the procession. It started here at the Commons. This is where City Hall is now. Went down around this way along the wharfs and then came back and ended there. That was pretty much the sum total of the city at that time. Held while New York State's ratifying convention was engaged in a hotly contested debate over the proposed Constitution, Platt's federal procession brought together men from every walk of life that might benefit from the boost to both domestic manufacture and foreign trade that he believed ratification promised. These included in this procession tradesmen, such as the pewterers who carried this banner, as well as merchants like Nicholas Kruger, who had employed Hamilton as a clerk for his family business in St. Croix, shipbuilders, and men like Platt himself, who had significant speculative investments in the maritime trade. Now, other cities also held federal processions around the time of ratification, but to my knowledge, New York is the only one where someone organized the parade not to celebrate the fact that the Constitution had been ratified, but to promote its ratification. The New York parade was before it was ratified. It was designed to encourage the passage of the Constitution. Moreover, while other federal parades focused on the prosperity the Constitution promised to manufacturers, most of them had a highly protectionist bent. The degree to which the New York parade emphasized the value of international exchange, both to manufacturers and to merchants, is really striking. And as an aside here, just speaking of international exchange of all sorts, what you're seeing here is actually in the Petraeus banner, which is in the New York Historical Society. It's on view constantly. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. If you see here, this is an image of a Petraeus workshop. This is taken directly from a French source, Diderot d'Alembert's Encyclopedia. So there was a literal exchange going on, even at the exchange of knowledge of the trades was even invested very closely in this type of work that Lafayette had been doing, that everybody had been doing, to try to bring together the two nations. Also, like many federal parades, New York's parade featured a ship among its floats. But in most of these parades, it was a symbolic ship. It was a ship of state, it was called. In New York, the vessel was christened the Hamilton, and during the course of that route, she exchanged a salute with the Spanish packet moored in the East River. It was a literal international exchange as part of this parade. L'Enfant, again, played a significant role in this event too. He designed the enormous banquet table. That's what this is. This is a banquet table. These are each spokes. He designed this enormous banquet table where members of Congress and other dignitaries stopped in the middle of the parade to enjoy their meal before carrying on with the rest of the festivities. And at that table, they drank toasts, as they were wont to do in the 18th century, many toasts. But here again, just to emphasize two of them, number 11, a toast to success of agriculture, manufactures, and the sciences, and number 12, following immediately upon it, may trade and navigation flourish. Whoops, sorry, I am pressing, there we go, okay. But Hamilton did actually move beyond theoretical, economic, and political support of manufacturing and trade by playing a very concrete role in creating one of my very favorite institutions. I'm completely nerdy about this, but I adore the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures. Hamilton wrote the charter for this corporation, which was founded in 1791 at the Great Falls in Passaic, New Jersey. And it was an arrangement that we might today call a public-private partnership. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody at too much length about this. But it was basically to become the first intentionally designed manufacturing town in the nation. And here we're looking at 2 pages from the corporation's subscription booklet. And it opened by asserting that, quote, the establishment of manufactures in the United States when maturely considered, will be found to be of the highest importance to their prosperity. It seems an almost self-evident proposition that communities which can most completely supply their own wants are in a state of the highest political perfection. And both theory and experience conspire to prove that a nation cannot possess much active wealth but as a result of extensive manufactures. And then it goes on to enumerate the types of manufacture that might be established at this particular site. It includes paper, sailcloth, cottons and linens, shoes, thread, hats, stockings, pottery, ribbons, carpets, blankets, wire, and more. And of course, in case you're wondering which engineer was brought in to design the waterways, it was L'Enfant. These were the waterways that would power the plants. Now, here in Washington, D.C., in the Library of Congress, where I actually had the privilege today of having lunch with one of the archivists who, in 1996, literally went to Lafayette's chateau at La Grange and microfilmed all of his papers that are now at the Library of Congress. So I actually had lunch with her today. She's been a great help to me over the years. Laura Auricchio is her name. So, sorry, I got completely distracted. So in the Library of Congress, in the Alexander Hamilton papers, we actually have all of the materials that he pieced together while he was working on his report on manufactures and while he was working on the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures. And he was clearly collecting and gathering information from all over the world, including significantly France. So this is written in French. It's an ideas for silk manufacturing. And it's quite detailed, and I would love to, I have not figured out exactly who crafted this for him, but I'm fascinated by it. And so anybody who happens to know a lot about 18th century French silk manufacturing, please let me know. It has become an obsession of mine. So basically what this shows is that he was gathering knowledge from Europe. Also a former colleague from Fordham, Doron Benatar, has written about how he was also encouraging, I believe it's called piracy, intellectual piracy, by also encouraging people from tradesmen from England, France, and elsewhere to come over here and help him get this thing started. But within the United States, too, he was also looking around the United States to see where was industry already flourishing here, and how could we either further invest in those places or learn from them. And what you see here are two things that I also, these are actually physically, this is not on microfilm, this is physical lace in the Library of Congress, which I also had the privilege of seeing recently. These are lace samples from Ipswich, Massachusetts, which became really a capital. It had tremendous success in lace manufacturing. And it's interesting, this object is in Mount Vernon now, and it's also from Ipswich, same type of lace. And it was presumed to have belonged to Martha Washington. So again, just as George Washington had worn an American-made broadcloth suit to his inauguration, Martha Washington too, who while very, very fashionable and certainly had ample French and other foreign clothes, also was using American manufacture where she could. So this all brings us back to 1824 and this remarkable tour. And again, we're looking at these, I'm showing you again the same objects that we looked at before. But now I'm hoping that you might see them in a somewhat different light. Because as we were seeing before, glass, wood, leather, silk, cotton, pottery, these are all the industries that Hamilton had written that they could foster at that one town in Passaic, New Jersey. But all collected right here. I also love the way that I just had to share this advertisement, because I just love the way that it sort of subtly encourages that you, wherever you are, ought to keep up with the Joneses and buy your own Lafayette paraphernalia. Because so all those who feel anxious of paying the honors to the nation's guest should lose no time in calling on the subscriber and supplying themselves with the following articles, which are worn by thousands in New York, Philadelphia, and other places. And these included Lafayette badges. DO is a symbol for ditto. It means ditto if you look at archival records. So Lafayette badges, ditto. Lafayette gloves, Lafayette belts, Lafayette sashes. Apply at A.H. Abrams, a few doors above Wallace and Friends. And a few pair of white silk hose are also for sale. At a very low price, apparently. $1 a pair, which actually seems kind of expensive to me. But I guess it is silk. Tradesmen and merchants and brokers also came together to celebrate Lafayette really directly. So what I'm showing you here is a wonderful piece of goldsmithing. It's a small medallion that was given as a gift to Lafayette when he arrived in Baltimore, and apparently he wore it on his sash throughout his whole day in Baltimore. But what's interesting to me about it, I could talk about this for ages too, the imagery, but what's interesting at the moment is this, which is a list of people who commissioned it. And so I looked up, well, who are these people? So this A. Denmead fellow here, so this was 1824 that he was one of the young men of Baltimore who commissioned it. Well, by 1851, he was the head of Denmead and Sons Iron Founders. And by 1855, he was the president of the city's mechanics exchange. Whereas R. France, who is another fellow who is one of the subscribers here, where is R. France? I don't know where he went. R. France, there he is, R. France, R.E. France. Well, he became a lottery and exchange broker involved with international trade. So these were basically it was in large part, certainly everybody was rallying around Lafayette, but certainly those involved with trade and manufacture were high among them. My very favorite piece of lore around Lafayette's tour, though, was the event that happened on September 11th, 1824, which was the 47th anniversary of the Battle of Brandywine. And it was a dinner held in Manhattan by the French residents of New York, and that's what you're looking at here. This was a brief description of it. And it celebrated two things at the same dinner: Lafayette and the Erie Canal, which was in the process of completion, but wasn't there yet. So that night, Washington Hall, which was the place it was held in Lower Manhattan, was reimagined as the crossroads of the globe with 4 faux marble piers representing the 4 corners of the earth at 50-foot intervals. So picture this is big. And a large model of the sun hanging from the center, 30 feet off the ground. Now, all of the decorations were apparently quite magnificent, but the most astonishing one was the one that represented the Erie Canal and ran the length of a 70-foot table. As described in the Evening Post of September 13th, quote, at one end was to be seen Lake Erie, in the center, Lake Ontario, and at the other end, Lake Champlain. And passage boats with passengers and baggage dotted the water that ran a winding course through the mock canals, while, quote, at a distance, various kinds of waterfowl sailed gracefully to and fro. Adding to the most charming effect of the scene, the canal's mossy banks were studded now and then with roses, and here and there interrupted by aqueducts, rocks, and bridges thrown over the canal at different places. Now, I believe it was more than a coincidence of timing that they celebrated the return of Lafayette and the not yet opened canal, because both of these would facilitate trade between Europe and the American interior. And that's what the Erie Canal did. It enabled trade to reach the American interior from the Atlantic. I also am fascinated by this flask, which on the one side, you could have bought in 1824 as well. On one side has a profile of Lafayette, and the other side, a profile of DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York, who started the whole Erie Canal project. So there was some connection that was being made between Lafayette and the Erie Canal. So I'd like to conclude by returning to the playing card that we saw some time ago, featuring Lafayette's profile beneath an eagle, clutching in its mouth a banner reading, American Manufacture. Now, inconsequential though a playing card might seem, I actually believe that it points to an important sentiment that coursed through the entire 1824-25 tour. And this was articulated in the address given in Lafayette's honor at the Philadelphia's American Philosophical Society on October 1st, 1824. The speaker that night observed that a squadron of steamboats had brought Lafayette ashore. And by the way, this is, you can't really see it, but this is a steamboat here in this, in this image here. And also, you can see also bales of hay and barrels. This is all about trade and also steamboat. So a squadron of steamboats had brought Lafayette ashore, and, quote, a steamboat has been a vehicle of his pleasures, emblematic of the enterprise, mobility, abundance, comfort, and equality of the country, which the last time our distinguished guest visited was poor, in debt, feeble, and uncertain of its destiny. In other words, the progress made in American industry and enterprise since the end of hostilities was crucial to the establishment of the United States. Lafayette had played an indispensable role in that progress, and all of the nation celebrated. Thank you. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Want to look at the playing card again? Well, I think you do because it's going to be recorded.
Doctor, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I've always been fascinated about how a man coming to America in 1825 could spend 13 months on the road.
I have no idea.
Did he have hotel reservations? Was there a carriage service to take him from here to there? I mean, how did that work? Do you have any idea from your researchers?
Yes. He absolutely. He walked, as I said, he walked, he rode horseback, he rode carriages, he got carried, he took steamboats, barges, rowboats. He took any amount of modes of transportation possible. But I will say it was a lot easier than his very first trip. So his very first trip in the United States, when he landed, you might not know this. He landed in South Carolina. And then he and his entourage had to make their way to Philadelphia. So they started out, he had some sort of notion that this was going to be like traveling through France at that time. And so this was 1777. And so he started out with carriages. These were very elaborate carriages, but they were making their way through the forest. So the carriages inevitably broke down and on their way from South Carolina to Philadelphia. The carriages broke down, and then the horses started dying, and then the men developed dysentery. And, basically by the time they got to Philadelphia to present themselves to the Continental Congress, they were not in the best of shape. So all I'll say is that the 1824 tour was a little bit easier than that. But I agree with you. It's remarkable. And, he was also not young at this point. I mean, he was born in 1757, and this was 1824. So, yeah. And he was not all that well. He had an injured leg. He had broken his leg and had not set properly, so he also walked with a walking stick. So the fact that he did all of this, I mean, I get tired when I have to, go from Manhattan to Queens. So it is remarkable. No, thank you.
This is a follow-on to the one. Did he have a travel agent? Who arranged all the trip? How did that get done?
His secretary's name was Auguste Levasseur. He also had his son, George Washington Lafayette, and he had lots of people helping him all along the way. Also, somewhat rather scandalously, although this is a whole other topic, he traveled and part of the time with a woman named Fanny Wright, who was a free love advocate, among other things. Yeah, sorry, it's true. But he did have a lot of help. He did have a lot of help. But he was, the trip was originally supposed to be just to the original 13 states, and he just sort of got carried away. And everybody wanted to have him. But also remember that this was this won't be at all familiar. This was a hotly contested presidential year that he was here. And everybody was vying to get him on their side, so everybody wanted Lafayette to, appear with them. Every politician, everybody. It was the Beatlemania before the Beatles. And everybody wanted to be seen with Lafayette. So he kept expanding his tour. And he ended up, as you said, Mark, visiting every state in the then Union plus the District of Columbia.
Over here. I loved your book. I hope you sell more copies tonight.
Oh, thank you. I don't think I have any to sell, but they're on Amazon.
I wanted to ask you if you have run across diary material or speeches or anything that would give us an insight into how Lafayette thought about geopolitics. Because so many histories talk about Vergennes telling the king, this is how we make sure the British never make trouble for us again. It sounds like he wants America to become a great power through this American manufacturer trip.
Yeah.
Did you find something like that where he lays out the geopolitics of the world?
That's so interesting. He did write about geopolitics quite a bit. He did. But now that you say it, it's fascinating. I had never thought about this. Because, of course, what's ended up happening is that the United States quickly surpassed France by far. I don't think he had that in his mind exactly. I think he actually thought, I don't think he could have actually conceived of that. I don't know if anybody could have. But that's really interesting. I don't think he actually thought that through. That, hey, wait a second, they could outshine us.
That's how we treat China.
Well, yes, that's not the, oh, yes. Indeed.
Quick question here. What was, at that point in his life, his wife had passed,
Yes.
What was his personal wealth at that point? Because he'd been very rich.
He had been very rich.
Is it gone?
And then all of his possessions were seized during the French Revolution. That's because he was declared an enemy of the Republic. Because contrary to the fact that he wanted to export democracy to most of the world, he actually didn't think France was ready for a republic. And he actually did not support the establishment of a republic in France. He wanted to see a constitutional monarchy, actually on the English model, in France. And so he was declared an enemy of the Republic, and all of his property was seized. He then he did flee the country because there was a call for his head, literally, in France. He would have been executed by the Jacobins had he stayed. He fled France, and he fled to Austria. So he was fleeing as an enemy because he was considered an enemy of the Republic. And he fled to Austria, where he was immediately arrested as an enemy of the monarchy. So he spent the next bunch of years in a series of Austrian prisons and then in exile. And then he came back. Basically, his wife negotiated his return. Napoleon wasn't so hot on having a rival general come back. So negotiated his return. She got back most of her family's wealth. The wealth was from her family, not from him. So her family had mostly been executed in the French Revolution. And she negotiated the return of a lot of their properties, and that's where they lived. That's where he lived the rest of his life, at La Grange, which was her family's property. So his wealth was greatly depleted. So if that's a long way of asking or saying, like, was it in part to get a gift of money? Did he come? Yes.
So so he was sort of tin-cupped it a bit.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Doctor, let's pivot for a moment from geopolitics to American politics. He was here at a time of a very contentious election 200 years ago. He met John Quincy Adams. He met Andrew Jackson. Even at his home in LaGrange, he had etchings not only of Washington, but of Adams and Jackson. So were there any particular revelations or surprises for you as he reflected on the election of 1824?
The election, for those, people might know this, but just to be 100% sure everybody's on the same page, the election of 1824 was the one that was decided on how many rounds did it take, do you know?
A lot.
It was decided in the House.
He kept the House of Representatives working all through the winter.
Right. So it was, there was no winner after the votes were cast. So it was thrown to the House, and it lasted months. The question of who was going to be president. So why am I telling you this story? Because are there any implications? I'm so sorry, I got completely lost. Implications for what?
Any particular observations that you still remember about his reflections on the election of 1824 and the politics in America at the time?
I think that he kind of, on one hand, I think that he lamented what he saw as the sort of, what do you call it? What he saw is kind of perhaps a dissipation of the ideals that he and Washington had believed in. As you know, better than me, I'm sure, Washington did not think that there should be any parties. There was a real desire to avoid partisan politics, and I think that Lafayette was somewhat dismayed by all of this. But on the other hand, look at what he'd been through in France. I think that he, at the same time, though, was appreciative that the American system was working, which was more than you could say for the system in France.
Thank you for a great presentation. The exhibit across the street also emphasizes his abolitionist sentiments. What can you tell us about how he was communicating that on his trip here in the
Sure.
in the
So
US?
I will be glad to tell you how he's communicating that, but also unfortunately, I have to complicate that story just a little tiny bit, because he was an abolitionist, 100% abolitionist, active, vocal, everywhere he went, abolitionist, meaning the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. However, he also believed in the 1780s, he took, his belief was that the best way to end slavery was through a gradual manumission. And he actually invited George Washington to come in with him on a deal of purchasing land in French Guiana, plantations, and the people who were enslaved on those plantations, in order to then practice gradual emancipation. So the idea was that he would purchase these plantations in Guyana, and he would educate the people who were there, pay them, and then eventually liberate them. He undertook this by himself. Washington did not go in with him. He undertook this himself, and he purchased 2 plantations in French Guiana and the people who were enslaved there, and he did not actually liberate them. And so what happened was, it had been his intention all along, and it's very clear. What happened was, when he fled the country and his properties were seized, they were among them, the properties and the people were seized. His wife wrote very strongly emotional letters to the overseas authorities saying, please don't sell these people. It was never the intention to sell these people. And they sort of said, well, whoops, sorry. Well, that's what they said. Basically, that sums it up. So they did. Then, when Lafayette returned from exile, he needed money. right? He was broke. Everything had been taken from him. And so the French Overseas Archives actually have there the letters that he wrote. He wanted to be compensated for those people. And what's fascinating about that is that the French government wrote back and said, well, no, we've now abolished slavery in the island, so they're free, so we can't compensate you for them. That story is not well known. That said, he was a vocal abolitionist, and he believed fully in the end of the transatlantic slave trade. And when he was here in the United States, he spoke everywhere on this topic, particularly in Virginia, and particularly in the State House in Virginia, which was a pretty bold thing to do, I think. Also, famously, there was a man, we've actually got his picture, sort of. Sorry, believe it or not, we're getting there. This fellow. This is a man named James, who was an enslaved person who helped Lafayette at the Battle of Yorktown. And he gained his freedom. Lafayette returned to the United States in 1784. And at that time, he submitted a petition to, on behalf of James, for James to gain his freedom. And he did. James was freed. James did, however, then go on to purchase his own slaves. A couple. He ran a farm, and he purchased a couple of enslaved people himself. However, he too was fairly down at heel in 1824, and he reunited with Lafayette in 1824. And there was a portrait made of James, who adopted the name. James Amistad had been the name of the person whose land he had been working. His name had been James Amistad, and he added the name Lafayette to his name in gratitude to Lafayette from the 1780s. So he became known as James Amistad Lafayette. And then, so there was a portrait made of James, which actually looks much more like you would actually expect a person to look in this time and context than he does in this image. It's a genuine portrait, really depicting him as he truly appeared. And it got attached to a broadside that was printed and circulated with showing a part of the letter that Lafayette had written, like on his behalf, for him to be freed, and that circulated and sold throughout Lafayette's tour as well. So Lafayette was something he spoke about really early and often throughout his whole U.S. tour. And sorry for the very long, complicated digression. Nothing is ever simple, is it?
Thank you for covering mercantile developments in cities all up and down. At the time that Lafayette came to Washington, it was a fairly new city.
Yeah.
And did any of your research really point to what was going on here at the time and how some of the commercial developments were trying to get a foothold here?
You know, that's so interesting. And just for the record, I know everybody knows this, but I have to say it because I've been saying the man's name all night. Washington was designed by L'Enfant. We can't get away from him. It's super interesting. You know, I've done a good deal of research. I spoke once for the White House Historical Association about the L'Enfant plan and so on and so forth. But I actually stopped there. I stopped once it got, built. I actually don't know. It's a fascinating question. I will do more research into that. Another book. Thank you.